I'd like to thank John and Steve for inviting me. You guys have a great campus here. I haven't been here before, although I was in Houston for many years, as John said. So thanks so much to John and Steve and for you for inviting me. Let me start by saying, talking a little bit about what my book is not about. It's not about the Alamo, and I hope I don't lose anybody right away. It's about 400 pages, my book, and I spend about 4 pages on the Alamo, which sounds about right to me, to be perfectly honest. And in what I do, I start in the 1820s, the early days of the Mexican Republic, go all the way up to Texas annexation in the mid-1840s, a little bit on statehood. So I cover about a quarter of a century. And I do talk about the Alamo and San Jacinto. Obviously, they are in there. But that traditional narrative of the Texas Revolution is something that I'm trying to, debunk, if that's the right word. Everybody knows that. I'm not telling you anything you don't already know. The Alamo is this foundational moment in Texas history. Everybody knows what it is when they see it. It's important not only for Texans, but for Americans as well. When I pitched the book to this New York publisher, I said, there's a lot more to the Texas Revolution than a 13-day siege in San Antonio. And they said, great, we did not know that, so write that book. So I did, and after about 3 years, I was in the final editing stages, and I got an email from the art department, and they said, we've got your cover art. We hope you like it. And I clicked on the PDF, and to my horror, it was a picture of the Alamo with smoke rising from the walls. And if nothing else, it was false advertising, because I just don't spend that much time on the Alamo. Why have we been so fixated? And we've only been fixated on this for about a century. It's important to remember that in the last half of the 19th century, Texans tended to forget the Alamo. Are some of you Texas history students of Dr. Davis, I think? I think, and also you said U.S. history is, so they actually did forget the Alamo in the late 19th century. They were going to tear it down in the 1890s, and they were going to expand a general store, which was on Alamo Plaza. So they had already forgotten it. It was only in the 20th century that the Alamo, as a symbol, begins to acquire meaning for Texans. I'm really interested in that. If you want to talk about that during the Q&A, I'm happy to do so. I teach Texas history at UT Arlington, and that's what we're doing now. I have a quarter of the course focuses on the Alamo and the Texas Revolution in memory. But my book is different. I just wanted to write a history of this 25-year period. And in my retelling of these events, the people that you know, the people that you may remember from 7th grade Texas history. We all took Texas history in 7th grade, right? If we were from the state, we did. Those people obviously figure in my history, but I talk about a lot of other people as well. And just by including more people, they're somewhat diminished. When I'm teaching Texas history now, I asked my students, about 3/4 of whom are Mexican American this semester, I asked them to name a famous Texan, and half the class chose Davy Crockett, who was here 9 weeks before he dies at the Alamo. So at best, he's an honorary Texan. And the rest chose Stephen F. Austin. That was pretty much it. So I think someone said Lady Bird Johnson. I voted for Stevie Ray Vaughan, but nobody else did. So those people, those white alpha males that John mentioned when he was introducing me, they really do dominate the stage. and they just crowd out everyone and everything else. And we really have told this story to millions of students at the junior high school level, and I'm afraid at the college level. Over the last 100 years, we've told the same story ad nauseum. Again and again and again. We seem to come back to Davy Crockett and Sam Houston and Stephen F. Austin. So you do know, if you're in Dr. Davis's class, that very, very recently, and really only like last year, some writers challenged this celebratory narrative. And what they did was they tried to argue that the leaders of the revolution were slaveholders and questioned their economic motives, painted them in a rather unflattering light. And I think that's a perfectly valid approach. I would say, and I told this to my publisher, when the book came out, my publisher was interested to know how was my book different from theirs. And I said, look, whether you lionize the Alamo defenders or whether you take a critical view of them, you're still focusing on a handful of white guys. And that's the difference between Forget the Alamo, I think, and my book. I'm really interested in all of the people of Texas, not just the honorary Texans like Davy Crockett. This is one of the most, and perhaps the most, racially diverse regions in North America in the early 19th century. And it is a place of convergence for peoples from all over. And those people are and they are all people of color, besides the Anglos that we're focusing on. Those people are almost entirely invisible. So what I wanted to do was tell the story. You know, obviously it has traditional elements in it, but also I want to know what what Native Americans are doing, what people of African descent are doing. They don't come up in these traditional histories of the Texas Revolution. How diverse was it? Let me just very, very briefly, and you probably know this, because I'm sure it's been covered in Dr. Davis's class. And there's a small indigenous population here. Prior to the 18th century, Caddos, who had been largely decimated by disease, Karankawas along the coast, Cuiltecan bands in central Texas. But it's not until 18th century that things, I think, get really interesting when you begin to see a sort of a population boom in Texas. Let's call it a boomlet, I guess, with the arrival of the Spanish and the establishment of the mission system. And soon afterwards, and really at the same time, in fact, begin to see the migration of nomadic and semi-nomadic peoples from the west and southwest, the Comanches, the Apaches, Wichitas from the Midwest. They're all coming in the mid-18th century. And then in the early 19th century, the early 1800s, you begin to see Native Americans coming from the United States, Native American refugees. And many, many different tribes from the lower South, from the upper South, from the Midwest, some of them. I'll talk about a few of them in a minute. Even the African American, or the population of African descent, is a lot more complicated and diverse than you might ordinarily think, or that we've been led to believe. And I spent a lot of time on my book on the African slave trade, which really kicks into high gear in the 1830s. Yoruba-speaking Africans are smuggled into Texas from Cuba in the early 30s because cotton prices have gone through the roof. And these people don't speak English, they don't speak Spanish, they can't even communicate with African Americans on the plantations that they've been sold to. Even the African American population is diverse. And so when we take the core group that we're familiar with, the Anglo-Americans, and we add everyone else, it becomes a really complicated story with a lot of moving parts. And so that's the story that I wanted to tell. What I didn't want to do was just tell, yet again, the story of Davy Crockett swinging old Betsy at the gates of the Alamo. Okay? So what I'm going to do, I'm going to give you 3 examples of the way in which a wider lens it helps us to better understand what's actually going on in Texas in the early 19th century. There we go. Okay. Well, this doesn't look too different from what you already know, I guess. Stephen F. Austin, let's start with Stephen F. Austin, the father of Texas, right? And in traditional books about this period, after the Mexican Republic is founded in 1824, Stephen F. Austin is already in Texas, trying to acquire an impresario contract that had been given to his father. Again, you know this. But is that thing on? Oh, I think he took the mic, didn't he? Yeah, well, we're not using the mic at all. In the teens, in the 18-teens, before Stephen F. Austin's father even arrives, before Stephen F. Austin arrives, there are Cherokee bands that are coming into Texas, and they continue to come into Texas in the 1820s. And they are followed by Native Americans who are refugees from other parts of the United States. And this goes on through the 20s and into the 1830s. The fact is that the first American migrants to Texas are not Anglo-Americans like Stephen F. Austin. They're Native Americans, like the Cherokees and the Choctaws and the Chickasaws. These people have ceded their land to the US government and sometimes to state governments, and they've headed west. This is 20 years before the Trail of Tears, the forced relocation of the Trail of Tears. So Trail of Tears is a little bit different, very different, where the US Army is escorting Cherokees and other tribes in the winter of 38 and 39. This takes place long before that. And after these treaties had been signed, the US government just simply assumed that they would move west to US Indian territory in Arkansas and Oklahoma. And some did, and they found conditions there unsatisfactory for all kinds of reasons. And some of them just drifted south across the Red River because there was really no one to stop them into East Texas. And some never got to US Indian territory at all. Some just simply headed west. They crossed the Sabine River and they established farms and homesteads in the piney woods of East Texas. And so this goes on throughout the 1820s while Stephen F. Austin is creating his own colony. And if you remember your Texas history from 7th grade, and I actually did teach Texas history my first year at Kincaid. And I'm not going to tell you when that was. It was a long time ago. I was in grad school. And I looked at one of the recent and the most popular Texas history textbooks about a month or two ago. And it hasn't changed one darn bit. Stephen F. Austin still sucks up all the oxygen out of the room. I mean, it's chapter after chapter on Stephen F. Austin. There is a sentence in one of those chapters, not even a topic sentence, which says, oh, and by the way, Native Americans were coming too. There are thousands of Native Americans coming here. While Stephen F. Austin is bringing in the famous Old 300, one of the Cherokee leaders claims, and I'm somewhat suspicious.
Would you care to use a microphone? I'm sorry, we got it working now. If you'd like.
Well, how am I doing? Can you hear me already? Can you hear me okay? Better with the mic. Got it. Thank you very much. Okay. So Stephen F. Austin's bringing Anglo-American settlers. We know this. Native Americans are coming as well. And to make the point, I think, a number of people who've read the book have commented on this. I really don't talk about Stephen F. Austin for the first 3 chapters. I do occasionally. I'm really much more interested in the Cherokees that are coming into East Texas before he actually gets there. So on the right is a picture of Chief Bowles. He's a Cherokee leader. He actually moves west in 1811. He goes to Missouri and then on into US Indian territory before he drifts south across the Red River. I don't have a picture of Richard Fields. I wish I did. In many ways, Fields is a more interesting Cherokee leader than Bowles. because Fields had speculated in land back in Tennessee. And Bowles was very old. Even when he made the trek, he was in his 60s. When he moved west, he was in his 60s. Fields was a much younger man, and he had speculated in land. And he understood, as very few Cherokees did at the time, the value of land, and more particularly, the value of legal title. And so Fields understood that the Cherokees and all of the other tribes are basically squatters in East Texas. And they don't own the land, they don't have permission to be there. The Mexican government doesn't even know they're there. They were encouraging Anglo-Americans to come, as you know. They were encouraging Europeans to come. But they really knew very little about the fact that this had become a destination of choice for a lot of Native American refugees. So while Austin is in Mexico City on one of his trips to court the Mexican government and to get an impresario contract, Fields and Bowles are there too. They're trying to do exactly the same thing. Now, the Mexican government really doesn't know what to do with the Cherokees, has never heard of the Cherokees until they arrived. And so it doesn't exactly tell them no, but it doesn't tell them yes either, and they go back empty-handed. And one of my favorite parts of the story is that Fields goes back and apparently, as far as we can tell, tells the Cherokees that it's all been a terrific success, and he now has permission to bring in as many Native Americans as he wants. That was clearly not true. Something had gotten lost in translation. And it's not until the mid-1820s that he writes this, hilarious, and I know it's a relative term, but there are things that historians find hilarious, and this is one of them. For me, he writes a letter to Spanish officials and says, hey, there are 8,000 Native Americans here, and I'm the superior chief of these people, and I would like to negotiate. And the panic which this creates in Texas, and the reverberations are felt in Mexico City because they don't really know what he's done or why he's done it. As far as they know, didn't Richard Fields and Bowles show up in Mexico City a few years ago, and didn't we tell them that they could not do this? That's all they knew. And so Richard Fields and Bowles, but particularly Fields, is responsible for bringing thousands of Native Americans into Texas in the 1820s. He's not an impresario, I get that. These people are still squatters, I understand that too. I'm not trying to say that Stephen F. Austin shouldn't be the headline here. I think we're always going to prioritize Stephen F. Austin when we talk about the migration of Americans into Texas. But the fact remains that Native Americans are coming in large numbers, and we don't talk about that story at all. It is a remarkable story of Native American migration. They don't come together, they come as individual tribes and tribal bands. They don't work in concert once they do come to Texas. I think that much is very, very clear. But we actually know very little about the Native Americans in East Texas. You may remember, and I don't know where you've gotten in your class, Steve, but the expulsion of the Cherokees in 1839, and the expulsion of the other Native American refugees in 39. I find that my students remember that from their 7th grade history class. But they don't know how they got there. They don't have the faintest idea. If they're Caddos or Cherokees, if they've been there 1,000 years or 10, they literally don't know. And so what I try to do in the first 3 chapters is talk about the Native American migration and how important it is to the settlement of East Texas. All right, so that's one. The second thing I'm going to talk about is a Mexican who gets very little attention. And we need to remember, this is a Mexican story before it becomes an American one. Lorenzo de Zavala. Lorenzo de Zavala is generally characterized this way. He is a Yucatan intellectual, a statesman, a Mexican federalist, who for some reason shows up in Texas in the summer of '35. He is a member, he signs the Texas Declaration of Independence, and he agrees to serve for a few months as the vice president of the newly formed Texas Republic. And that's it. That's the attention that he gets. I talk about Lorenzo de Zavala a lot in this book, and I talk about him as one of the very few Mexicans who understood that you could make a fortune in East Texas lands, but only if Anglo-American migration continued. And so we talk about Stephen F. Austin, but we should also be talking about the Mexicans who worked so hard to open the doors for their own economic interests, let's be clear, to Anglo-American migration in the 20s and the 30s. But for my purposes tonight, I'm not going to talk about that. I'm going to talk about his relationship with someone who I'm sure you all are familiar with, even if you don't know him particularly well, and that's Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna. I have to say, a lot of nonsense has been written about Santa Anna over the years, primarily by Texas historians. He's seen as this almost cartoonish, autocratic tyrant. Even Mexican historians have had a hard time figuring him out. He's really quite enigmatic. And for my money, you can take it or leave it. I know that some of you are US history students. I see him as analogous to Andrew Jackson, because Andrew Jackson is a backcountry military leader. So is Santa Anna. Andrew Jackson saves his country from foreign invasion in New Orleans. So does Santa Anna a decade later at Tampico. The reason historians have always failed to understand Jackson is for the same reasons Mexican historians have failed to understand Santa Anna. We always apply these standards with Jackson. If I can just digress for a second here, because I teach Jacksonian America at UTA as well. And I make my students understand the historiography, and it's like, so here's a historian who says that Jackson is a strict constructionist, and here's another historian who says he's a loose constructionist, and here's one who says he should be understood as a Southerner, and another who said he should be understood as a Westerner. Is he a progressive? Is he reactionary conservative? By which time my students just could care less, really, about Andrew Jackson. The reason I think we've misunderstood Jackson is because we've applied the same standards that when we think about John Quincy Adams or Henry Clay or John C. Calhoun, we see these guys as ideologues. And that's not who Jackson was. And that's not who Santa Anna was. Didn't really care about Mexican federalism, didn't really care about Mexican centralism. He can be understood in one way and one way only. Who are his friends and enemies at a particular moment in time? And that's how you understand Andrew Jackson, if you want to understand his role in the bank or the nullification crisis. Okay, sorry for that digression, but I want to talk about the relationship between these two men because it really does highlight how Santa Anna is motivated by personal reasons and personal animosities. He has a relationship with Zavala, which goes way back and which is never mentioned. Zavala and Santa Anna conspire to overturn the presidential election results in 1824. The re-election in 1828. And install a man who they think is more compliant, Vicente Guerrero. And for a while, they're correct. But then Santa Anna and Zavala start to bicker, and there's a falling out. And Zavala goes into exile in 29. And he goes to New York, marries an American woman there, continues with his business interests, working with American land speculators. And he finally comes back when friends at home are able to sort of pave the way for a reconciliation. So he comes back in 1833. And 1834, he is sent to Paris as the Mexican minister to France. And that's when he and Santa Anna have their big falling out, when Santa Anna abolishes the Constitution of 1824. Zavala is furious. He was a very strong Federalist. He was an ideologue, unlike Santa Anna, who had no ideology at all. And he writes a letter of resignation Says, I'm coming home, there's nothing I can do here, I can't represent this government. And it's very polite. But then he writes this blistering, what we would call op-ed today, which is published in the opposition newspapers, in where he accuses Santa Anna of, he said, you have torn the Constitution to pieces. And it's clear that after that very public letter, that relationship is dead. Santa Anna immediately recalls him and to the capital, and Zavala has no intention of going. And the reason is because he does not want to face the fury of the Mexican president, his former friend and now arch enemy. So he makes it known that he will go to Texas, and he wants to be a simple farmer. That's what he tells everybody. Nobody believes him in Mexico City because he was and had continued to be a political animal. And in fact, their suspicions are correct. He goes from France to New Orleans, and he meets with Mexican expatriates, men who had been sent into exile when Santa Anna abolished the Constitution. And after the meeting in New Orleans, off he goes to Texas, and he makes landfall in the summer of '35. Again, these are not things that have traditionally preoccupied Texas historians. And so I thought, when I was doing the book, I knew there was a lot that I wanted to say about the early period, the 20s, leading up to the revolution itself. And I knew I wanted to talk about the Republic because that was kind of my own area of expertise. But I thought, during that 6 months when the revolution occurs, is there really anything new to say? And what I found was, in fact, that when Zavala arrives in the summer of '35, Mexican officials are just panicked. And there are letters from San Antonio which go down to Saltillo, which eventually make their way to Mexico City and to Santa Anna's hacienda near Veracruz. And they think that Zavala is going to lead make Texas a beachhead of opposition. And they're freaked out about it. And that is when, in the late summer, early fall, that Santa Anna decides that he is going to lead a campaign into Texas. Every Texas history book that I'm aware of says that the Mexican army was formed and the campaign was organized in December, when after the siege of San Antonio, if you remember that. That's just simply impossible because mounting this campaign was a major undertaking. The Mexican army was bankrupt. They had to secure 2 loans before the army could be organized. Troops had to be conscripted. They had to be trained. They got very little of that, by the way. This took months. To suggest that the Mexican army was just simply waiting for the green light to head north doesn't really square with the facts. It was because Zavala had arrived, and it's because what they thought Zavala was doing. Now, later, it becomes clear in the late months of '35 that this is not going to be a revolt led by Mexicans like Zavala. It becomes clear that this is an Anglo-American revolt led by settlers and aided and abetted by volunteers from the United States. So the entire complexion of the revolt changes in a matter of months. And Santa Anna clearly knows this by the time he reaches the Rio Grande. He knows that Zavala is not in charge. But the fact is that the campaign had been organized because of what Zavala had done. And Santa Anna had made the decision to lead it himself when he could have delegated this to his subordinate generals, his general staff. And even though he knows that the revolution has changed its shape, it's now a revolution by Anglo-Americans to secede from Mexico, even when he knows that, Zavala is not far from his mind. After the siege at the Alamo, he goes east, he gets to the Brazos River, which is flooded, and he learns something really important, which changes the course of the revolution. He knows, and I think he already knew, that the Texas Army was to his north a few miles. But he also knew and learned there on the east bank of the Brazos that Zavala, who was now part of the government, was about a day's march away. And what he does is take about a quarter of the army and head off after Zavala into East Texas, and that is the army that will meet defeat at San Jacinto. When San Jacinto takes place, 3/4 of the army is still on the other side of the Brazos, trying to get across. And so I guess I'm speaking to those people in the audience who are traditionalists and who are still wedded to that traditional view of the Texas Revolution and the white alpha males who feature so prominently in it. If you're a traditionalist, I think you would want to know why the Mexican army got there in the winter, weeks, if not months, before it was actually expected. And if you're a traditionalist, I think you would want to know, why is the Mexican president leading this campaign? And then most importantly, if you're a traditionalist, I think you would want to know why Santa Anna does something totally inexplicable. He moves east with a part of the army and to certain defeat at San Jacinto. You should want to know these things. And so I think the Zavala-Santa Anna relationship is a great example of how it's not just simply a wider canvas that we need here, but if we use a wider canvas, it shines new and fresh light onto the things we thought we already knew. We thought we knew everything there was to know about the Texas Revolution. We've ignored this guy. And how have we ignored him? Let me direct your attention to Exhibit A. I don't have Exhibit B, so this had better do. In 1974, John Jenkins published this magisterial 12-volume set called The Papers of the Texas Revolution. Every letter that Houston wrote is in there. Every letter that Houston got is in there. Same thing with Travis and Crockett and so on. Volume 12 is the index, and if you want to do research on Houston, you turn to H in Volume 12. T if you're doing work on Travis. If you look up Zavala, this is what you find. First of all, his name is misspelled, and he never spelled it with 2 L's, so that should tell you something. But what's even more remarkable is this is what you find in the index on the last page of Volume 12. Too numerous to list. In other words, they do not tell you where you can find his letters in the preceding 11 volumes. And those 4 words tell us so much about the way American historians have tried to understand these events. Clearly, there are a lot of letters there by Zavala. And by the way, Jenkins didn't even have access to the Mexican archives. So there are a lot more that he didn't use. But even the ones that he had, he just did not itemize. He does not have them in the index. There's too many of them, and he can't really be bothered to tell you where they are. I mentioned this to a friend of mine who's a historian of this period, and I said, do you believe this? Because everybody who does research in the Texas Revolution goes to Jenkins. Papers of the Texas Revolution, you have to. And he thought about it for a minute. He thought, oh, well, okay, so maybe Zavala's name begins with the letter Z, and so by the time Jenkins got to the Z's, he thought, oh, to hell with it, and he just shipped it off to the publisher. And I thought, okay, that makes a weird kind of sense, but if the father of Texas' last name began with a Z, his papers would be itemized in the index. If the guy who defeated Santa Anna at San Jacinto, if his name began with the letter Z, his papers would be itemized in the last volume. We've just ignored this guy, and it's a shame because he has an enormous impact on the Texas Revolution in so many ways, and the events that precede it as well. How did this happen? We've written hundreds of books on the Texas Revolution, and he's still a peripheral, marginal figure. And the answer, I'm afraid, is a rather dispiriting one. American historians have made this story all about us. And we need to remember that it's a Mexican story as well as an American one. Last thing. The last thing, I don't really have many images, I'm sorry. The last thing really speaks to the term Texas Revolution. What are we going to call it? Well, I know what Anglo-Texans called it immediately after the rebellion was over. They were calling it the Texas Revolution. And it's easy to see why. Because Anglo-Texans in the 1830s were really obsessed with the American Revolution. That's why Stephen F. Austin's the father of Texas. George Washington was the father of his country. Stephen F. Austin had to be the father of his country. Anglo-Texans were in no doubt that they had a revolution which was the equal of what had transpired in the 1770s. But what about subsequent generations of historians? They tended to follow suit. Traditional historians tended to follow suit. In the 1980s, a very great historian of the American Southwest, David Weber, questioned this, and he said, this kind of looks like just more manifest destiny to me. This is just Anglo-Americans pushing across the continent and bringing enslaved people with them. And I and a number of Texas historians followed suit, followed David's lead. Not everybody, to be sure, but I wrestled with this a lot and had been wrestling with it before I wrote the book. And when I started the book, I thought, well, I'm not going to call it The Revolution at all. And my publisher said, well, you can call it whatever you want, but you're calling it The Revolution on the cover because that's going to sell books. And I said, well, okay. But in the pages of the book, I was calling it a revolt with a lowercase r, a rebellion. It was a secessionist movement. It was a war for independence. But I kind of avoided the term Texas Revolution, capital T, capital R. And somewhere, and I don't even remember when, but somewhere during the writing of the book, I thought, you know what, this really is a revolution. And we need to understand it as such. But we've been so narrow in our definition of what the revolution is. In the traditional view, the Texas Revolution sort of starts and ends with this sort of crash of cymbals and a blast of trumpets, with Sam Houston's victory at San Jacinto. And we lose interest after that. And American historians haven't paid much attention to the 10-year Texas Republic that follows. And I'd always been interested in the Republic, and I came to see the Republic as this essential period where we really do understand what the Texas Revolution had been all about. And for Anglo-Americans, they knew, or they were quite determined to create the kind of society they couldn't have in the United States. The Texas Constitution is a remarkably, I'm reluctant to use the word progressive, but a populist document, let's call it that. There was a manic populism in that 10-year period where the Texas Constitution and the Texas Congress passes, this is in the Constitution, and the Texas Congress make good on the promises in legislation in the years that follow. Debtor relief, anti-monopoly legislation, public education, and most importantly of all, a gigantic land giveaway. 4,600 acres to every family if you can prove that you were in Texas when the shooting started. More if you fought in the Revolution, if you show up on any of the muster rolls. It was a bonanza. And what they were trying to create was really a sort of a white male utopia. But, and this is the irony of Jacksonian America, and it's an even greater irony here. Those advantages, those benefits that would accrue to white adult males very often came at the expense of people of color. So the 4,600 acre land giveaway is going to come from Native American groups who are occupying this land. And of course, we know what happens to the immigrant tribes, the Native Americans who've come in as refugees in the teens and the 20s and the 30s. By 39, they're all gone. The only people who remain are the Alabama Coushatta, if you know where the Liberty area is, to the east of here. Why are they allowed to remain? Because they are in a very densely forested region. They're just north of the Big Thicket, but in those days, the Big Thicket expanded far to the north. That land was just simply unsuitable for commercial agriculture. But the Cherokees are gone. The Shawnees and the Delawares and the Chickapoos and the Choctaws, they are all gone by 1839, okay? What about people of African descent? Well, slavery, of course, is now enshrined in the Constitution. It can't be constrained or infringed upon in any way. And even the US Constitution doesn't say that. I think most poignantly is what happens to free blacks. And I spend a lot of time talking about one man in particular, William Goyens. He's a businessman in Nacogdoches in the Mexican period. He owns land, and a lot of it. He has an inn in town. He has a grist mill and a sawmill outside of town. He builds a big mansion on what the locals come to know as Goyens Hill. He represents himself in court. He votes, and he is politically active as well. After the Revolution, he can do none of these things. And in 1840, the Texas Congress will pass a law, and I'm not familiar with any parallel in the American South, where all free blacks must leave. And if you want to stay, you need an act passed on your behalf. The law is really unenforceable, so the expulsion effort never really takes off. But William Goyens has very prominent friends. He was a friend of Sam Houston's, he was a friend of Thomas Jefferson Rusk, and he got them to write a petition, and they presented it to the Texas Congress, and he is allowed to stay. But his life changes in immeasurable ways as a result of the revolution in 1835 and 1836. So the point that I'm making is that we cannot just simply look at the revolution and sort of say with some finality, it ends on April 21st, 1836. We need to look at the consequences, because it's only then, going into the Republic, that we get an understanding of what the rebel leadership really wanted. Okay, so to sum up here, those are the three things. What do we learn when we have a wider lens? This, I think, is the important point, and I guess the main takeaway of my talk. And it's this: we can't just simply take people of color and sort of insert them into the traditional narrative. Some historians, I think, they've known since I was in grad school that this was an Anglo-centric narrative. It was just all about white guys. And so there have been attempts to bring people of color, but just to sort of insert them in such a way, and this is purely unconsciously, by the way, it never really changed the traditional narrative. And so what I'm trying to do in this book is to say, look, what we really need to do is set aside that traditional narrative completely. There's no point in revising it. Just set it aside and say, that was great. For about 100 years, that was our view. That was the canon to explain the Texas Revolution. But in the 21st century, are we really going to ignore Native Americans? Are we going to ignore Mexican Americans? Are we going to ignore people of African descent? They are half the population when the revolution breaks out. And they're more than half in the years preceding it. They're half the population, and we, to a very large degree, they are invisible. I forgot to mention, I'm sorry, Mexican Texans. They are not expelled as dramatically as Native Americans in 38 and 39. But what clearly happens during the Texas Republic is life is made so difficult for Mexican Texans that they really do begin to leave. And by the early 1840s, there are very few Mexican Texans in Texas at all. They come back during the statehood period, but there are no Mexicans in Nacogdoches, there are none in Victoria, and very few in San Antonio in the early 40s as a result of discrimination. Okay, so I would really urge you to sort of rethink the Texas Revolution. We can't just sort of shoehorn the experiences of other peoples into this narrative. What we need to do is understand their stories and not just, as part of the Anglo-American experience, to understand their stories in their own right. And then you kind of knit or weave those narratives together, and that's the sort of meta-narrative that you come up with. It's a complicated story. There's a lot of moving parts, as I said, but I think it's terribly important that we understand that we look at Texas, which has always been seen in sort of one-dimensional terms. Davy Crockett, Sam Houston, William Barrett Travis. The beauty of Texas history for me during this period is its sheer complexity, its confusion, its chaos. It's a lot more to know, but I think it's a richer story as a result.
So would you say toxic masculinity played a role in the traditional narrative of the Texas Revolution?
Can you repeat?
Yeah, sure. Does toxic masculinity play a role in that traditional narrative? Yes.
What would you say is the role?
I mean, that's such a great question, and I feel silly giving you a one-word answer, but the answer is absolutely. I mean, we have focused on these, the exploits of white alpha males, and when historians, we've told this story so many times, it was like, okay, well, what else is there to say? And it's, well, did William Barrett Travis draw a line in the sand? Did Davy Crockett surrender at the Alamo? We keep coming back to the same cast of characters. Traditionalists have been fixated on the lives of these men. And to be clear, this isn't a polemical work on my part. I don't have an agenda. I'm just trying to tell the story. And there are some people that I clearly admire, and some of them are Anglo males in the book. But I try not to tell you who they are. You can probably figure out. And I'm hoping people can draw their own conclusions. So this isn't just simply a hit job on the heroes of the Texas Revolution. I think if you are looking for martial heroics in the Texas Revolution, you can find them. And if you're looking for racial subjugation, you can find that too, okay? But you're exactly right. This toxic masculinity has so informed the history written by men, okay? White men wrote the history of Texas in the 20th century, and go figure, it was all about white men, right? So that's your problem in a nutshell. But yeah, that's a great question. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Taylor, and I'm from Houston.
Okay.
Good for you.
But you have mentioned at the beginning, like the similarities between Andrew Jackson and Santa Anna, and I thought that was really interesting because I had never thought about that. And I think that's important when you're talking about like, is it whitewashing? Because it was written by white people. I don't know, but I think that's a good point to like compare those two like that because I thought, I'm repeating the same stuff again. But I just want to like, do you have anything else that like is on your mind about that?
Well, that was kind of a digression already, so I don't want to digress too much. I didn't want this to be about Andrew Jackson. I just wanted to make sense of Santa Anna. And I think we try to think of these, historians, they always want to look for, what's the ideology? The assumption is that people always have an ideology. Like Calhoun had an ideology. He may not have agreed with it, but he clearly had one. Like John Quincy Adams had an ideology. And in Mexico, Lucas Alamán, Lorenzo de Zavala, and others, they had ideologies. But when you look at Jackson and Santa Anna, what you find is those metrics just don't work. These guys could care less about ideology. It's who are their friends, who are their enemies, and we're done. And there are so many examples of this in the book of Santa Anna, doing something at the behest of his friends or doing something that he thinks will antagonize his enemies. And when I see Santa Anna doing these things, and some Mexican historians think, what's going on here? I just think about Andrew Jackson, who is doing exactly the same thing.
Okay, I think I kind of phrased it like too broad. It was that point, but I was thinking more of how, I don't know the words, but maybe like how we would see people of color because the way we learn history, so like how we use Andrew Jackson's like, maybe the idea of him is more like, oh yeah, he was a fighter, but then when we look at Santa Anna, it was like, oh no, like a tyrannic leader or something.
Right.
And so I was thinking of maybe more like how, from the perspective history was written, how that might have affected how we saw like people, like other leaders of color.
Yeah, well, it's definitely true, I think, that in Jackson's case, I mean, Jackson has, back in the 1960s, liberal historians, and many of them were, coming out of universities loved Jackson because they saw a populist Democrat. And you look at the historiography now of Andrew Jackson, and boy, what a 180-degree shift, because we see him as an enslaver, and we see him as someone who has a very, very poor track record with Native Americans, the Trail of Tears being the best example. With regard to people of color, you can't obviously apply that to Santa Anna, but you can see similarities in their lack of ideology. So I think in the case that you're mentioning, that's the one metric where it sort of really doesn't, the analogy doesn't hold up, okay? Well, that we need a new narrative of the Texas Revolution. That's it. I mean, when you think about it, over the course, it's been 100 years, and we need to retire this narrative. And how many seventh graders have been taught about just Stephen F. Austin, Stephen F. Austin, Stephen F. Austin? Millions. And I'm not being hyperbolic. Literally millions. And we're not going to talk about Native Americans here? I mean, it just seems just like professional malpractice. And again, I'm not trying to be polemical. I'm not trying to say, just everything is wrong in the traditional narrative. But boy, do we need something else to understand these events.
So I'm actually researching for my project on inclusivity of other cultures in U.S. history, so I'm kind of interested in your topics here. But would you consider yourself pioneering this discussion in your scholarly circle, or is there other scholars that are researching this to push to open up the narrative on Texas history? Well,
I mean, there are a lot of really good historians, okay, Texas historians. I mean, but academic works tend to focus on narrow topics, okay? So Andrew Torgett, prize-winning book, Seeds of Empire, was all about slaveholders and Texas expansion, and that came out 5 years ago. It was a great book. But books for the general public, and that's what this is, okay? I wrote a book that I thought my brother could read, and he's not a historian or an intellectual, by the way. And I thought, okay, I want to write for that, somebody who would find this fun to read. And so I have to say that if you look at the popular histories, they tend to emphasize that traditional narrative. One that I can think of that came out a few years ago at the Revolution had a 25-page appendix on, did William Barrett Travis draw a line in the sand? And I remember reading that and thinking, I don't care, frankly. But forget the Alamo is a popular book. But it's not really a book about the Texas Revolution. Only the first third is. The other 2/3 are about Alamo and memory. So it doesn't really do it. It's unfair to compare my book and theirs because they don't really do a deep dive into the 20s, 30s, and 40s. And I think some of the best parts of the book are how the Alamo has changed over time. I'm using it next year. How it's changed in the 20th century. I think it's great. But on the early 19th century, that's not what they're trained in, as historians. Yeah.
Do you think that that this should change us Texans? Because we're very proud of our history and we're very proud of it. And we're like, oh, we want to find it. Do you think that this new perspective should change other private Texans?
Yeah, I mean, so I think the question is, Texans are proud of their history, and will this change the way they see their history, or see it with with a lesser degree of pride, or perhaps shame? Is that what you're saying? I mean, look, I think we need to just face facts here, and that this is a violent period, a period of just unremitting violence. And almost all of that violence has a racial character. And we simply have to face that fact. And once we get beyond that, once we stop trying to, elevate a group of white men who really were just a group of white men, let's be honest. Once we stop doing that, I mean, this becomes just a fascinating story. I mean, I love teaching Texas history. And I don't teach it the traditional way. And I get excited about teaching it. And I do because I think it's an extraordinarily complex story. But you just simply have to move beyond that traditional narrative, right? I speak to Texas teachers sometimes, and they don't know what to do with sort of the new scholarship, because they have spent so much time seeing these people as sort of larger than life. And yet, who do we know in our own lives who's larger than life? I mean, why do we feel the need to do that to people in the 1830s? We don't do it in our own time. So what gives? I think what gives is that we have been sort of hardwired to think of people in the past as somehow nobler and larger than we are. And I just see them as regular folks. And I don't have a problem with that. We get into trouble there by naming schools after famous people, right? Because they're always going to disappoint us eventually. And anyway, we have plenty of examples of that in the Arlington School District. Anybody else? Yeah.
So would you say that Santa Anna, in the context of achieving his goals, was a pragmatist?
Was what?
Would you say that
In the context of achieving his goals?
Was a pragmatist.
Oh, was a pragmatist. Oh, yeah. Absolutely. I mean, there's just no question about it. I mean, we often tend to forget this, but Santa Anna was responsible. I'm getting into the weeds here. Santa Anna was largely responsible for Stephen F. Austin getting out of jail. And then he was under sort of house arrest, and then he was given freedom to move within the city, and ultimately they sent him home. Santa Anna had a lot to do with that. And he'd shown no interest. This is relevant to the point that I made earlier about Santa Anna. He showed no interest in Stephen F. Austin's legal case at all until a young woman brought it to his attention. And at that point, he became sort of something of an advocate for Stephen F. Austin, and was responsible for letting him go back to Texas. Yeah, but is he a pragmatist? Actually, wait a minute. If he's pragmatic, that assumes there is an ideology and he's willing to bend the rules to make things happen. So just forget what I said 2 minutes ago. I don't think he has an ideology at all. I just don't. So is he pragmatic? I think he's self-interested, and but he doesn't understand the rules of the game the way other people do. Yeah.
So you mentioned the need to change the teaching narrative to mesh together the kinds of traditional things and these new ideas. Do the texts exist to do that for teachers?
No.
And people are just scared to take them? They don't exist?
Well, I mean, it's not just teachers. I mean, I've spoken to so many teachers, I think, who really do want to be able to provide a multi-ethnic, multiracial narrative, and part of the problem is the state legislature.
Are they
Yeah, yes. That's putting it mildly. I mean, yes. And that I've had teachers tell me that, I could get into a lot of trouble teaching this. And so that's a real shame, I think. I mean, I just look at my students at UTA, like, as I said, 3/4 of them are Mexican American, and they've all been taught about Davy Crockett, Sam Houston.
Is there anything that we can do to make it different when we become teachers potentially, or
So,
next generation
sure.
jobs?
Yeah, so I was at the Texas State Historical meeting. No, I'm sorry, it was the Western History Conference last month in San Antonio. And there was a panel on this. And someone said, and I knew everybody on the panel, I wasn't on it myself, but someone, and I'm trying to remember, I think it was a professor at U of H who said, one of the ways you can do this is just simply by using primary sources. The Texas Constitution is pretty clear about what they wanted. The legislation that the Texas Congress passes is pretty clear about what they wanted. And so if you use primary sources, that's one way of doing an end run around this traditional narrative that just wants you to focus on the heroics of Crockett and Travis and people like that. Of course, they've got to read those documents, which are written in 19th century language and can be pretty dry. So you have to help them along.
Well, thank you, Sam.
Thank you.
Be sure to follow us on our social media, like this video, leave a comment, and hit that subscribe button to be notified about our latest content.